Gators Breakdown, because there's never a dull moment in Gator Nation.
The Gators Breakdown podcast is ready to go. I'm your host, David Waters. You can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. And if you're watching on the YouTube version, you can already see my esteemed guest here, Andy Staples, senior college football writer from The Athletic, joining us right here on Gators Breakdown. We were playing this last week. Andy had a busy week last week with The Athletic, and we got him on about a week after his big article he released on The Athletic last week. So, Andy, thanks for hopping on Gators Breakdown.
Oh, happy to be here, Dave.
Yeah, so, hey, let's get straight into it. You had the article last week on The Athletic titled How a Once Dominant College Football Program Fell Permanently 2 Steps Behind. And the word permanently sticks out to a lot of Gator Nation.
Yeah, I don't write the headlines.
Hey, that was a question.
I've been saying that since my newspaper days. I don't write the headlines, and I don't. That was one of those I was like, I don't know if I would have gone permanently. But if you Ms. and Mr. Editors think that it's permanent, okay. I don't think it's permanent. I think it's hard to overcome in this particular environment right now in the SEC. Kirby Smart being as young as he is and basically taking the mantle from Nick Saban and running with it. That's the problem that I think Florida's up against. And it's not really dissimilar from what Gus Malzahn was up against Nick Saban in the past decade, where it kind of almost doesn't matter what you do. You can be good and you can be really good, but you might still not be good enough to beat your rival. And that's a weird place to be.
Especially for Gator fans, and we'll get into it a little bit, but, since 1990, you dominated Georgia for so long. And it was just second guess. We're going to go to Jacksonville and we're going to beat Georgia. Georgia had a really good team in 2002. And then
it's almost like we got to find some 80-year-olds to come in and be like, Georgia used to dominate this series. This is not new. This has happened before.
All I have to do is go to my dad. He's like, you know what? He enjoyed the 90s more, and I think maybe anybody more than Spurrier, because he grew up in Jacksonville, a Gator fan. He was tired of losing to Georgia, and you got that streak going. So, Andy, let's go into it a little bit. And you talked, Scott Strickland was mentioned in the article as well, and there was a quote in there. He said, "Since we won our last national championship, we've had years where we've had some good success, high-level success." And he goes on to say, we've had incredibly erratic with some incomprehensible lows that you wouldn't expect at the University of Florida. So, Andy, there's been 4-win seasons. There's been 6-win seasons, losses to Georgia Southern, Vanderbilt last year, Muschamp, McElwain, Mullen, now Napier. Are those incomprehensible lows more than just win-loss record for Scott Strickland?
I just think he's trying to find a way off that roller coaster, and it's really hard to do. It's hard to be what Georgia is right now, what Alabama has been, what Florida was. And the question I think they're wrestling with right now is this something that Florida can do on a regular basis? Can they have that sort of success on a regular basis? Or was it a result of having 2 legendary Hall of Fame coaches? Because Steve Spurrier and Urban Meyer don't come along all that often. So, can you be successful all the time? Like, I'll give an example. Ohio State is always good. Look in their history. Find a down period. There isn't one. Oklahoma is almost always good. Other than mid to late 90s, Oklahoma, through its history, has always been good. Florida hadn't been like that. Texas hasn't been like that. USC hasn't been like that. Alabama hasn't been like. Georgia hasn't been like that. It's not that easy to do. And so what Strickland would like to do is get Florida to a place where it can be consistently in the playoff hunt, in the national title picture. And with 12-team playoff coming in, I think that's a reasonable goal. Winning the national title as much as Florida did 3 times in 18 years, well, actually 3 times in 12 years, that's probably not a reasonable goal. We've seen it happen with Alabama, and I think we're going to see Georgia win 3 in probably that time span or more compressed time span. But it's not normal. It's not something you should expect. What you should expect is to try to be something like Ohio State has been, something like Oklahoma has been, where you are good every year and a lot of years you're great. And that's what they want to be, but they're not there yet. And the roster that they had when they fired Dan Mullen was not going to get them there. So they hire Billy Napier, who, according to basically every coach you talk to, they will say, other than Kirby, Billy will follow the Nick Saban process more closely than anyone. He understands what works and what doesn't. You know, a lot of the folks who get hired after they've worked for Nick Saban say, "Oh, I took everything. I know exactly how he does it." But then they don't want to do the things that Nick Saban does that are unpleasant. Like, Nick Saban is the lead recruiter on Alabama's top 10 recruits every year. Nick Saban has the same recruiting meeting every week at the same time. His calendar is filled out 18 months in advance. It is not a particularly fun life being Nick Saban, but it works. Kirby does that. Billy Napier does that too. The question is, can Billy Napier do it as well as Kirby Smart or Nick Saban? And we don't know that yet. You know, I look at Saban getting to Alabama, and Saban didn't take over a particularly great roster at Alabama. It's not a good situation. Remember, Jimmy Johns was one of their better players, the linebacker that they converted from running back. He got caught selling drugs in the parking lot of the facility. Like they had problems when Nick Saban took over to Alabama, but he really fixed that roster quickly. You know, and this first full cycle recruiting class was that 2008 class. So that's Julio Jones, Dante Hightower, Barrett Jones, Robert Lester, Mark Barron. It was a murderer's row. It's the best recruiting class of all time. If you talk about the results and what those players wound up doing. I mean, Mark Ingram won a Heisman. Julio is going to be an NFL Hall of Famer. Dante may be a Hall of Famer. So that's what you're being judged against. Kirby, year 2, goes to the national title game, wins the SEC. Now, I would argue that Kirby took over a lot better situation than most coaches. Mark Richt was not doing badly. It's just that Georgia figured out that good was the enemy of great in that situation. Napier took over a situation that was closer to what Saban took over. And the problem is, you look at this recruiting class that he just signed, and you look at the results on the field, and you're like, I don't think he's going 12-2 this year like Nick Saban did in year 2. And now part of that is probably because there was no other Nick Saban and there was no Kirby Smart in the SEC at the time. Now, Les Miles is coming off a national title at LSU, but it wasn't the same level of competition.
And you had Urban.
Right, you had Urban. But but Nick didn't have to play him every year. And so it was a different time. And that's what Billy's up against now. He's up against Kirby Smart, who has the best program in college football and doesn't seem to be slowing down any way, shape, or form. You have Nick Saban still being Nick Saban. And I realize we're all predicting disaster. They might lose 2 games again. But they're still going to be good. They still are incredibly deep, have a bunch of NFL players on their roster. Now you have Brian Kelly at LSU. Brian Kelly, who was doing great at Notre Dame, considering the level of difficulty, goes to a place where the degree of difficulty actually drops from Notre Dame. It's easier to win and build a roster at LSU than at Notre Dame. So now he's there, and you've got but you've also got Josh Heupel's got Tennessee better. Shane Beamer has South Carolina feeling like they're on the upswing. This is a tough
Florida struggles with Kentucky now.
Right. Oh, and by the way, Florida State is finally not a disaster anymore.
Yep.
They're run very competently by Mike Norvell. And
Texas Oklahoma on the way.
Exactly. So that's what Billy Napier's up against. And I just mentioned Norvell. If you look at what happened with Norvell, I think that's sort of the model for what you'd like to see from the Napier experience, where he took over a situation that was not good. They didn't have the resources to just turn around and fire him after a couple of bad seasons. But if you watched, they were making incremental improvements every season. You could kind of see it every week, and you realize, okay, they're getting better. And then year 3, they're pretty good. Year 4 feels like a potential breakthrough year. Now we'll see. They might not live up to the preseason hype, but they're certainly in a much better place than they were when Mike Norvell got there. They fixed the offensive line. They have a quarterback they like and more in the pipeline. They have playmakers at receiver. They have NFL guys all over their defense. That's what Florida State's supposed to be. But they certainly weren't that when he got there. And everybody was ready to throw him out of town, but they just fired Willie Taggart and they couldn't do anything about that. Well, here's Billy Napier. He's got, what, a $31.8 million buyout after this season? They ain't firing Billy Napier. It doesn't matter how bad they are. So he's got a chance to actually do this the way he wants to. It's up to him to figure out if that's going to work or not. And if it does, then they could potentially land on that consistency that they're looking for. I saw an On3 graphic yesterday I thought was interesting. They were looking at some players, uncommitted 2024 players.
Oh, yeah.
Who are high on Florida. And the graphic had the Gators, and they were the higher percentage because that's who they're projecting them to commit to. And then the team that's kind of second for them. Well, if you look at some of the teams, Clemson, Georgia, like that's not who Florida was beating for players in the Dan Mullen era. Like that's what Billy Napier's
that competition.
Do. Yeah. They wouldn't even be in the hunt for those guys. So that feels different.
Yeah.
Right now. And so now it's May. Those guys have to commit. They have to sign. But if you can do that, if you can land that plane and DJ Lagway comes and he's as good as everybody thinks he is, then maybe you got a chance. That's the thing. The patience with Napier is going to be forced. Like, I don't think there's anybody excited about what's going to happen this season. I think, 8 wins is probably, that feels like a ceiling to me. Maybe I'm wrong.
That's about where I'm at too. Yeah.
Yeah. So it could be 7. It could be 6. It might be 5. Vegas had 5.5. I thought that was a little low.
I did too. One game was. But 6.5 I'd have had no issue with. But 5.5,
I think that's
like,
fair.
Yeah,
6.5 would be fair. So, but you got to be patient. And as you know, Dave, there's a lot of the fan base that is not patient, that grew up on, basically woke up on third base.
Yeah.
And was like, this is like this every year. And, because I grew up a South Carolina fan. So I was just used to losing, used to getting clobbered every year, and ended up going to Florida and walking on at Florida. And at that period, it's just win all the time. Mm-hmm. Like there's nothing but success. Everything but a national championship feels like a failure. And that's not normal. It's not a normal outlook. And, maybe at Ohio State, maybe at Alabama, they've got the history to feel that way. Florida doesn't actually have the history to feel that way. You've got 2 coaches who did this, Steve Spurrier, Urban Meyer. Nobody else has been able to do it. So it might be this kind of hard.
New merch, new sale, new Gators Breakdown merchandise available at gatorsbreakdownmerch.com, including this shirt I'm wearing. It's dropping just in time for summer with new designs. You can get yours with a 25% discount right now. There are plenty of options to choose from, including men's, women's, t-shirts, tank tops. Use promo code YTShopping25 to get our biggest discount ever and support Gators Breakdown while celebrating the Gators with these stylish summer looks. That's promo code YTShopping25 for 25% off. Click the link or head to gatorsbreakdownmerch.com to take advantage. Part of this, Scott Strickland, look, there's a lot on his shoulders, I think, with this. And I think you said the patience might be kind of forced. It might be kind of forced from his angle, too, because is he really going to get a chance to hire a third football coach?
Yeah.
If it doesn't work out with Billy Napier. So my thing is he's going to be as patient as possible because he needs this to work out. And you hope that doesn't dig the hole even deeper for Florida because he has to hang on to Billy Napier.
Well, and that's the gamble. Now, if the season's bad, they're not going to fire Billy Napier. If the fan base or more importantly, the influential donor base, if they decide they want some blood for this season, if it's bad, then I think And I think Scott Strickland understands that. I think he understands the position he's in, and that if things aren't going well, because the cost is so high to fire Billy Napier, they're going to turn and look at him if they're not happy. But again, if the arrow is pointing up, if things look like they could get better in the future, then he's going to be okay. And he can just keep saying, just be patient, just be patient, just be patient. But if it looks bad, yeah, they're going to make sure he doesn't hire the next person if they think ultimately that Billy's not going to work out.
Yeah, scary proposition there. So, Andy, we talked about it and maybe how Florida got here, but in thinking about this episode and how Florida got here, I mean, Cam Newton laptop, urban health issues, Will Grier PEDs, Pack the Swamp comments by Dan Mullen, not caring about bowl games, quote unquote recruiting season, and now recently NIL, Jaden Rashad. I mean,
shoe throw. Please don't forget the shoe throw.
There you go, shoe throw. Not playing Kyle Pitts in that game.
Yep.
Look, Gators Breakdown says there's never a dull moment in Gator Nation. But when you look since Urban and you just think about everything that happens off the field, it doesn't even have. I mean, look, it probably is in relation a little bit to win-loss record, but I mean, it is unreal what goes on at the University of Florida.
Let's just zero in on one of those things. Will Grier, I think he's a really good example. And I wrote a lot about Will when he got to West Virginia, so I understand that situation pretty well. And basically, the parties mutually agreed after the suspension that Will would be better off somewhere else. Imagine if the coaching staff there, and this was Jim McElwain at the time, he actually signed with Muschamp, but this was McElwain, had said, we got your back. You made a mistake. Stay here. We want you here. We need you here. Will would have been playing sooner than he was. So remember, this was back in the old days. He had to sit out a year at West Virginia. He would have come back in the middle of that 2016 season, which Florida won the SEC East, by the way. Can you imagine if Will Grier had been Florida's starting quarterback at the end of 2016 and 2017? McElwain might still be here.
Yeah. Yeah. It's great. And since the whole recent storyline that we're talking about in a different direction.
In 2018, he would have been throwing to a freshman Kyle Pitts.
Would he have been here though? 15, 16, 17, 18. That would have been his fourth year.
That would have been his fifth year. He would have been fifth year senior.
Right, fifth year.
2018, by the way, the year he lit it up for West Virginia.
Yeah.
Nearly got them to the Big 12 championship game.
Probably hoping he would have had a lot of success. He probably wouldn't have been here.
Maybe, but it would have been really interesting to see.
He would have had that time missed with the PED. So yeah.
Yeah. So if that had happened differently, maybe there's a lot of if it had happened.
Not only that, McElwain had those. He had Jamar Chase committed at one time.
Exactly. Now I don't know that he ultimately would have gone to Florida. I think he still might have wound up at LSU, but
probably. But if you had that success with Will Grier, let me go play with this guy.
Well, right. And the firing, that coaching staff doesn't get picked apart, and so I think you can take any one of those. Like if Will Muschamp chooses someone not Charlie Weiss as his first OC, or basically comes into Florida with a different offensive mindset.
Yeah.
If he says, you know what, if Will Muschamp had come to Florida the way Sam Pittman came to Arkansas, saying, I'm going to run the offense of today or the offense of the future, how different would that have been? Because obviously they were great on defense.
If he would have used Jeff Driscoll like we thought Jeff Driscoll would have been under Urban Meyer.
Oh, Jeff Driscoll has been so good in Urban Meyer's offense. People forget what a great athlete he is.
Yeah.
The dude's still in the NFL.
I remember watching the Jaguars last year, and there's Jeff Driscoll playing for the Texans.
Yep.
Eddie, it looked like Florida had their guy. You mentioned 2018, and Dan Mullen comes in, found instant success with McElwain's players in 18 and 19, battling Georgia, winning a lot of games. But when you have Alabama and Georgia in this league, it was always in the back of my mind that, and I got chastised for it at the time, that recruiting wasn't where it needed to be to catch up and consistently compete with those programs. Then 2020 comes along. Florida had all the right pieces on offense. In that 2020
Georgia had a bunch
season,
of injuries.
Yeah, so polarizing.
Jordan Davis was hurt. Yeah, Monty Rice was playing on a bad foot. Like all the stars came together, and it just crystallized that narrative that Dan Mullen's the better X's and O's coach and Kirby's just a recruiter. And it's funny because you were always, on the, hey, this is not good enough in recruiting side. I know you were. And there's a lot of people who were like that. And it's basically people who watch other teams.
Yes.
And, I have the good fortune in my job that I get to see what do the rosters look like. I get to watch some practices. I knew this wasn't a roster that could compete for the national championship on a regular basis. And I think a lot of other people who followed Florida knew that. But there was this big group that said, oh, this proves it. Dan's the better X and Kirby's just a recruiter. No. Always take the just a recruiter. Always take the person who will bid you a better roster because you have a better chance of winning consistently with a better roster.
Andy, how far do you think that dropped Florida? Because look, it was going so well in 2020, and yet all the stars were aligning. COVID hits, and it does mess some things up. And look, it really affected Mullen. Whatever happened in his mind.
He was a changed person after that, and you can't put that on Scott Strickland or anybody in the Florida administration. Like that just happened to them. They had a coach who had gone to 3 consecutive New Year's Six games. You're like, hey, it's rolling. And he changes his mind about what he wants out of life. Nobody can predict that.
Yeah. I mean, it is funny how fast, because Florida was supposed to be the dream job. He had the background at Mississippi State. He had the background at Florida, returning to Florida. And you had that 2020 season to kind of point to where, hey, look, maybe it just comes together. Look, we know recruiting isn't good enough for a long-term, consistent competitor at the top of the level. Now,
but don't get me wrong. Winning is going to come, right? Yeah,
right.
I think people who follow recruiting closely will tell you they were looking at it and like, why does it look like it's getting worse? Like
that was my thing.
And again, we go back to who are they beating for players? That other logo in the crystal ball prediction matters. Like if it's got a tiger paw or a G or a Buckeye or an A, that's what you want. If it's NC State, if it's the strutting wolf from NC State, you ain't winning the SEC.
And it's funny too because Chauncey Bowen's a running back commit for the Gators. Just announced over the weekend he's going to take a visit to Georgia. And I had some messages sent my way. It was like, oh, I guess we're going to lose him to Georgia. I'm just like, well, hold on now.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. And you want that. You want the players Georgia wants. And if you're ever going to catch up with them, you're going to be in these battles. You're going to see
and you're going to lose some of them too. You have to accept that.
Yes. But it beats the alternative, as you said, of, okay, we beat NC State for a guy. And look, it may work out. But more times than not, it won't get you where you need to be. So, Andy, a big question. I did have this sent to me a little bit too with this, and going back to your article and some things that came out from it. Is there dedication from all the parties involved at Florida to get this fixed, to get this better? Now, we see the new facility, but it took time. We saw the issues with NIL, but it took time. And we know, like, if we go back earlier, Strickland's job's tied to Napier. So, where can it get better? Where does it need to get better for Florida to find that consistency?
Oh, I think from a spending standpoint and a dedication of resources standpoint, they're where they need to be. They're finally where they need to be. They took them a long time to get there, but they're there, and there are no excuses on that end. Like if this doesn't work out, they cannot make the excuse. Like the coaching staff can't make the excuse that we didn't get enough resources. They got the resources this time, but the NIL stuff needed to get ironed out, which I do think they have it ironed out now. I think the organization they created, the Florida Victorious, that looks like the organizations that are working in NIL, and it's basically a fundraising arm, and that's what it has to be. So I think they've got that part figured out. It seems like one hand knows what the other is doing, that was the problem with the Jaden Rashada thing.
Thank you.
And there was a lot of it wasn't miscommunication. It was kind of non-communication that caused that. And so I think they have all that part ironed out. The question is, really boils down to the basics. It was what we were just talking about. Can Billy Napier and his staff beat the Georgias and the Ohio States and the Alabamas for players and build a good enough roster to compete with them? That's it. That's what it boils down to now, because they have the resources. They have the facilities. The NIL thing seems to be, fixed might not be the right word because we don't know. They just got this organization in place, but it seems to be the right type of organization to make it work. So now they've just got to do it. That's the big question. Mm-hmm. And we won't know until we see who signs in December. We won't know until we see what the roster looks like going into the 2024 season. I know nobody wants to hear that. I know nobody wants to hear that this season probably isn't going to end in a championship of any kind. That this season, if they win 7 games, they're probably doing all right. Nobody wants to hear that, but that's kind of where they're at.
Yeah, reality of the situation falls into place here. Like, we know this is not where it needs to be and where many want it to be, but let's just face the reality here for a second. And as you said, be patient. There's no choice but to be patient right now.
Yeah, exactly.
and see where it goes. So, Andy, one more for you before we sign off right here on Gators Breakdown. Swagadelic from Gators Breakdown Plus. He wanted to know, we're going to zoom out a little bit. Let's look college football. Yeah. Let's look SEC
no problem.
A bit. And he said, with the new SEC alignment and schedule coming out, where do you think that's trending? I know it's been back and forth between 3-6, 1-7. How that kind of is new news about maybe the SEC maybe switching and changing their mind to a 1-7 model.
Yeah.
And now also the ACC and Pac-12 of what's going on there. How you see that working out?
So the SEC scheduling thing, yes, it does seem like you're hearing more trending toward 1-7. I still can't figure out if that is just them with a Hail Mary to try to get a little more money out of ESPN for the extra conference game. Because let's be real. The 3-6 model is the only one. If those are your only 2 options, you don't have an option.
Exactly.
The 3-6 model is the one you're going to pick, because are you going to be you're going to have Texas and Texas A&M in the same conference and they're not going to play every year? That's the stupidest thing you could possibly do. Like, it's incredibly dumb.
Yes.
So, like, I don't get it. Like, Arkansas has been in the league for 30 years, has never really had a real rival, has never been able to figure out. Those people hate Texas more than anything. You can make that game every year. Did you see that game in Fayetteville 2 years ago? Like, it was electric. You're not going to play that every year? It's crazy. It's crazy.
And Texas A&M, I'm sorry, you just got to play Texas and LSU every year. I mean, that's
well, no, they don't get to play Texas every year. They play LSU. Yeah.
I'm just saying, if it comes to that, like, we need that 3-6 model. And I'm sorry, A&M, but I need you to play Texas and LSU.
You killed the Florida Auburn rivalry, which was great.
Man. Yes.
Killed that. But then you spent how many years protecting Georgia Auburn and Tennessee Alabama? And you're not going to play them every year now? Like, what was the point of all that? It blows my mind. Like the Tennessee Alabama thing. Okay, you could have said, well, Alabama's kind of dominating it. So, yeah. Did you see that game last year? You're saying you don't want that every year? Give me a break.
Yeah, it rekindled, and I think that brought to people's mind who says, that's not a rivalry. Because look, if you're a Florida fan in the 90s, Tennessee, Alabama wasn't all that much. In the 2000s, it really wasn't all that much. But, I think that did bring up there is a history between those two teams. And
it's a streaky rivalry. It's really streaky. Like,
it's like
Alabama dominated.
It's like
Tennessee dominated. Exactly. Very similar.
Yeah.
So I cannot stress this enough. If they go 7-1, it is the stupidest thing they could possibly do. And the SEC doesn't make a ton of really stupid decisions. This would be really stupid.
You know how much in 2020, I hated COVID, but you know how much I enjoyed those 10 SEC games?
They enjoyed it too. There were a lot of people in the league that were like, 10 SEC games. That might be even better than 9. So the ACC and the Pac-12, I'm assuming this means the off the field. Because the Pac-12 on the field, probably deepest it's been in years. Mm-hmm. But I don't know what happens until we see what the terms of that TV deal are. And they've kept that really secret and under wraps because I don't think they want anything leaking out beforehand. Basically, if it's disappointing, if it doesn't match what the Big 12 does, then they're at risk of losing some schools. And they would probably go to the Big 12 would be my guess. But if they can get something comparable to the Big 12, even, a little less but close, I think those schools want to stay together. Yeah. So I think that we'll just have to wait and see what happens. The ACC's really, I think, long-term a lot more interesting because it's not going to work long-term. they have that grant of rights till 2036. If you're Florida State, if you're Clemson, if you're Miami, if you're North Carolina, who knows that on the open market you would be coveted by the Big Ten and the SEC, you want out. You want a way out of that before 2036. And because like Florida State, they've been the most vocal about it and just doing the math. And they're saying, $30 million shortfall between what the ACC is going to pay out and what the SEC is going to pay out. And that is actually a fairly conservative estimate. It could be more than that. And just add it up. 30 million times 12 years. I'm bad at math, but that sure sounds like $360 million to me. Well, if you look at the history of what people pay when they leave conferences, it's about 60% of what they're supposed to pay. So really it's just math. When they feel like they're at the point where they'd make as much, where they're just at the break-even point. If they could get into the SEC, they say Big Ten. I don't see Florida State as being a candidate for the Big Ten, but certainly North Carolina, Virginia would be Big Ten candidates.
Georgia Tech.
Florida State, Clemson would be SEC candidates. If you think you can get in, and again, we have no idea if the Big Ten and the SEC are going to want more members because they haven't operated as 16-team leagues yet. I think that's an important factor to think about. Like, they probably want to see how this works for a couple of years once those teams get in, because they may say, you know what, 16 is good. That's enough. Or the networks may say, adding more probably isn't going to add a lot of value to your next deal. So that's the part they've got to figure out. Now, if the networks say, well, if you could add, that'd be pretty good. Now, I don't think ESPN would want that because ESPN's got its costs controlled right now with the ACC contract.
Right.
But so that's the part that is the wild card here, because if they don't think they can get in the SEC, they don't need to challenge that grant of rights.
Yeah, and I wonder with this 12-team playoff, I mean, really, are you still giving automatic bids to an ACC that looks like this?
Well, it's not an automatic bid to the ACC. It's just the top 6 conference champions.
That's right. So
you could reduce that number if you wanted to.
Right. I guess that's where I was going to anyway. Like, with this new format, do they find a way to, kind of change their auto qualifiers?
I think they're gonna look at it and they might tweak it if they need to, because depending on what happens with the Pac-12 contract, you may see more contraction. And basically, the race, I think, is going to be the clear number 3. And that's going to be between the Big 12 and the ACC. And we've seen the ACC in a kill or be killed position before. Because remember, that was the position the ACC was in with the Big East back in the BCS era. And John Swofford, the commissioner, realized that they were in a kill or be killed situation. And so he killed the Big East.
we never got our FSU ACC or Miami ACC title game.
Nope. Divisions are done. Wouldn't it be funny if they wound up in the title game this year with no divisions?
For the last one. that was pretty much the reason to put them in different divisions.
That's exactly right.
We thought
they're going to play in every championship game. But never, not even once.
Because Jacksonville was hosting that ACC title game to begin with, and they were just, we're going to have FSU and Miami every year, and this game will stay here forever, and it never worked out.
Yeah, no, and I think the system they have now is quite a bit better. I think I think it'll be better for them, because let's say Florida State beats LSU this year, and then beats Clemson the first time around, and
those games are both really early in the season. I believe.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So LSU's the first week, and then the Clemson games, I think, week 4. So if they were to beat them, this scenario, that probably is the way it works, because you need Florida State to beat LSU, and you probably need Clemson to beat Florida State in the ACC title game in that situation. And then if LSU, let's say, wins the SEC West, then you've got both of them kind of in the mix for the 14 playoff. And in that situation, both of them would absolutely get into a 12-team playoff.
Yeah.
Which, if you're the ACC, you're going to be trying to angle for those two teams in the playoff in a year. The SEC and Big Ten are going to be trying to get 4, whereas the other ones are all going to be trying to get 2. I think the Big 12 actually going forward has the best chance of 2 in a lot of seasons, because they're going to be very evenly matched.
Right.
But if Florida State continues to be on the upswing, if Clemson hiring Garrett Riley allows them to kind of get back where they were, then the ACC is going to have a chance to do that. But if I'm Clemson and Florida State, I am looking at that grant of rights. I'm sending lawyers to look at it all the time. And eventually I'm just doing math. When does the shortfall, when does it become I'm losing more by staying here than by leaving? And I don't know where that line is because we don't know how strong the grant of rights is. If the grant of rights holds and the ACC truly owns their television rights, they're not getting out till the 2030s. But if it doesn't hold, they can get out sometime this decade, and that changes things.
Yeah. We always hear contracts are made to be broken, but as you said, that one pretty ironclad with the ACC. So, hey, lawyers find things, so we'll see.
Exactly. Hey, billable hours, always undefeated.
There we go. Andy Staples, The Athletic, senior college football writer, joining us right here on Gators Breakdown. Andy, let's do it again before the season.
Yes, sir. Appreciate it, Dave.
See ya.